Jake Thompson couldn't understand what had happened. Just a few minutes ago, it had been an ordinary afternoon. He was out in his field, checking the fence, watching the sunset amid the peaceful barking of his dog Jax. But now, there was a mother lion in front of his eyes. And this huge, ferocious animal, showing no threat, was crouching on the ground, head bowed, looking him straight in the eye. It was as if she was asking him for help. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, sweat beaded on his forehead, but his body didn't move. It was like he was frozen. Jax was no longer the vicious dog he normally was, barking at every stranger, sniffing every move. He just stood there, ears back, staring at the animal. His fur was erect, but his spirit was quiet. At that moment, he realized that he was not alone in the field, but he was not in danger either. This was different. This lion was not standing in the middle of the wilderness, but in the center of emotions. He was speaking with his eyes, and Jake was listening. But the lion wasn't the strangest thing. The strangest thing was that Jake wasn't afraid. He was supposed to be scared. He should have run. He should have at least screamed. But something inside him, something he had never felt before, anchored him there. This animal wasn't threatening. On the contrary, it carried a secret. A deep, silent, sad secret. Those few seconds when they locked eyes with the lion felt like a lifetime to Jake. Because what he saw in those eyes was the past. It was pain. A trace of something lost. It was the same last look he had seen when he looked into his daughter's eyes in the hospital corridors all those years ago. And in that moment, Jake realized that the lion was not just an animal, but a father, a mother, a loss. The lion got up. He started to walk away, slowly. But after 2 steps, he stopped. It turned its head. He looked into Jake's eyes again. Then he kept walking, as if he was calling him. Jake didn't take a step. At first. But his heart was saying something else. His heart was saying, go. This is your story. Don't be afraid. It's different this time. So she started walking. Jax followed, hesitantly. The lion disappeared into the meadow, but his footprints were still fresh in the wet earth. Jake never spoke. The wind was silent, too. It was as if nature was listening to the moment. He didn't know where the lion was taking them. But that wasn't the point. The point was that a story that had been closed years ago was now reopened in the gaze of a strange creature. With every step, a memory stirred in his heart. Lily, his daughter's voice echoed in his ears. Her last look came before his eyes. Her eyes slightly ajar, a faint smile on her lips. He had never forgotten that moment. He couldn't forget it, but he had buried it deep, very deep. Now the eyes of a lion brought it back to the surface. The lion stopped in front of the barn. The old barn that Jake had never used, the one he hadn't locked for years, the one that was almost falling apart. The door half open, dark inside. The lion turned his head, looked at him. His eyes were harder this time, more insistent. Jake took a few steps closer. There was something inside. He could feel it. His heart raced again, but this time not from fear, but from the unknown. He approached the door. Inside there was the smell of hay and damp earth. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw something. A small body, unmoving. A lion cub, barely breathing. Its fur was covered in mud. His eyes were closed. His body was so still that at first he thought he was dead. But then his chest rose and fell slightly. Jake knelt down. He held the cub carefully in his arms. It was light. So light it was as if he was holding air in his hands. He realized his hands were shaking. He tried to swallow the tears that had come to the tip of his nose. "Did you bring this to me?" she whispered. The lion did not answer. But from outside, just inside the door, a deep, sad murmur sounded like a moan. Jake hugged the cub. He began to walk briskly home. Jax followed behind him, but he kept looking back. The lion wasn't following them. He was just waiting. Jake came in through the porch. He spread the blanket on the floor. He placed the cub by the fireplace. He groped in the closet for an old baby blanket. He didn't want to use it, but Lily's blanket would give this puppy warmth. She wrapped it with trembling hands. She wiped the baby's nose with a wet cloth. It had a fever. It was weak. His breathing was irregular. The lion was still in front of the door. He wouldn't set foot in the house. But he wasn't leaving either. Jake approached the window. They locked eyes. This time, there was a glint in the lion's eyes. A hope. And in that moment, Jake knew. This lion had entrusted him with his cub. Because he had no choice. Because an animal had chosen a human. And Jake didn't know what he had done to deserve it. But this bond was now his responsibility. The cub moved its head slightly. Jake crouched down beside it, trying to slow the beating of his heart. "Don't give up," he said in a whisper. "He chose me. I won't leave you." At that moment, another voice came from outside. It was soft, slow, almost like a prayer. Aslan was still waiting. His eyes were looking through the glass. There was no ferocity in those eyes. Only patience, only love, and fear. Jake didn't sleep that night. He never left the cub's side. He checked his temperature. He counted his breath. He didn't let go of his hands. And outside, just off the porch, a mother lion waited unblinking until morning. There were no words between them, but no words were stronger than the bond they had formed. And that night, Jake made the quietest but biggest decision of his life. This cub will live. No matter what, because sometimes, even nature needs humanity. Jake stopped for a moment after wrapping the cub in the blanket. There was something heavy in his chest as he looked down at the little body in his hands. His heart was pounding like he was holding a baby, but his mind was screaming, "It's a wild animal. What are you doing?" But in his eyes, it was not an animal. This was a living being. A child. Just like Lily once was. He sat down by the stove. He stoked the fire a little more. The cub was still shivering as the room warmed. A small liquid trickled from the tip of her nose, her breathing ragged. Jake groped for his old first aid kit. He had a few basic items for treating animals, but this was different. This was a medical situation. And he wasn't a veterinarian. He looked out onto the porch. The lion was still there, motionless, waiting, watching him, not looking into Jake's eyes, but into the center of his heart. "Do it," his eyes were saying. "Give her back to me." Jake looked at the puppy in his hand. A little life under a warm blanket, keeping him alive, maybe saving what he couldn't hold in the past. He put his hand on the cub's chest. He counted its breathing. It was very weak. Heartbeat irregular. Jake stood up, headed for the kitchen. Hot water, clean washcloths, a syringe. He gathered everything. All the while, in his mind, he thought of Lily. The last time he'd held her with his little hands. "Daddy, don't be scared. I'm fine," she had said in the hospital room. He hadn't forgiven himself that day. Now, it was as if life had given him another chance. But time was running out. She warmed water in a small bowl. She gently wiped the baby's body with the cloth. She dried the damp places. She tried to bring the fever down, but it was still too high. Outside, the wind began to blow gently. With a rustle from the window, Jake went back inside. The fire in the fireplace was burning stronger now, but the cub's body was still cold. Jake folded the towels in half and placed them under the blanket. Inside, he wrapped the warm stones he had put in the socks. It was all like a tent, trapping the heat around the cub, but then he noticed something. A shiver ran down the side of the little body. His legs moved slightly. His eyelids moved. Jake held his breath. Something inside him said, "It's starting." Just then a voice came from the porch. Jake quickly turned his head. There was no lion. He went to the door. He reached for the knob, but didn't open it. He just opened it slightly. The emptiness, the wind, silence. But then, a rustle from the left. He turned to find the lion lying a few meters away, curled up on the ground. His eyes were closed, but his ears were perked up. He was waiting, just like Jake. At the same moment, with the same desperation, Jake turned back. The cub had moved a little more. You could hear it breathing now, but it was still very weak. His little body seemed to be climbing uphill with each breath. Jake sat down in the chair. He put his palms to his face. He felt both hope and fear. Would he make it? Just then, another sound came from the porch. But this time it was heavy. It sounded like footsteps. Jake jumped up and ran to the door. But there was no one outside again. He panicked for a moment. Then he looked down. There was a spot in front of the door where a lion was digging in the dirt with its claws. When he looked carefully, he realized there was something buried in the ground. A black object. Small. Jake bent down and dug into the earth. His eyes widened as the object was revealed. It was an old collar. Rusty, frayed. And there was a letter on it. L. Jake's eyes widened. How could this be? This was the lost collar of Lily's dog, Lucy. Years ago. Lucy had disappeared shortly after Lily passed away. When Jake gave up looking for her, he lost the last trace of his daughter. But now, this collar had been dug up by that lion. Why? Jake fell to his knees. He gripped the earth with his hands. He wasn't just holding the collar. He was holding the past. Lily. The silence that buried her. The lion had done nothing. He handed her back her own past. She didn't know why. But that's when she started crying. Behind him, Jax barked. When he looked back, the lion cub had moved. He lifted his head slightly, trying to open his eyes. Jake jumped up. He lifted the blanket. The little eyes flickered open. Her breaths were still weak, but she was alive now. "You're strong," Jake whispered. "You will return to your mother." At that moment, there was a hum outside. The sound of cars. Jake ran to the window. There was a pickup truck in the road. Two men got out of it. Neighbors from the neighborhood. They were holding binoculars and looking around with worried eyes. Jake rolled down the window without opening the door. "Jake, is everything all right? We just saw a lion in the field. The police are coming." Jake's heart clenched. He turned back. The lion cub was still breathing under the blanket. The mother lion outside the gate was nowhere in sight. But the danger was imminent. If the police came, they could kill the mother lion. Jake closed the door. He went back inside. They didn't realize the connection. Humans are afraid. Animals can't tell. But now he had to make a decision. Either she would tell her neighbors everything, or keep quiet, at the cost of a life. But just then, the lion cub looked up. It looked at Jake for the first time. There was gratitude in those eyes. Faint, but evident. Jake made up his mind right then that he wasn't going to say anything to anyone. This story was between them. Him and the cub and the waiting mother. And outside, a mother lion, still staring at him. The silence in the forest gave way to a buzzing emptiness as Jake dropped to his knees and gasped for breath. As the lion took the cub in its mouth and disappeared into the depths of the forest, it looked into his eyes for the last time. There was gratitude in that look, yes. But there was something else, something Jake couldn't understand, but he felt. It was as if he was saying, "I believed in you." It was like, "I saved you too." The cops were watching in amazement. None of them had pulled the trigger, but their fingers had been stopped at the last moment. There was a silent agreement, a bond between wild animal and man, unspeakable, but felt by everyone present. Jake slowly stood up. One of the policemen came up to him. "Are you all right?" he asked. Jake nodded, but his eyes were in the forest. Not after the one who had left, but after the feelings he had taken away. "Why did you have the puppy? What happened here?" Jake didn't answer. His mouth was dry. His heart was still pounding. "He just came," he said. "He needed help." The cop touched his shoulder. "It was the strangest thing I've ever seen," he said. "But I don't know. It was like the animal trusted you." Jake rolled his eyes at him. "It didn't," he said. "It chose me." That word, choose, hung in the air. The other policemen kept their eyes on the forest. Everyone was a little speechless, a little embarrassed, a little shaken. Because what they had just witnessed was not for the books. It wouldn't fit in the news bulletins. This was something else. Something that penetrated the heart, something that transcended logic. The cops slowly dispersed. Jake's knees were shaking as he walked back. When he entered the house, Jax rushed to his side. He rubbed his head against his leg. Jake put his hand on the dog's head. "He's gone," he said in a whisper. "But he stayed here." Jax didn't understand what he meant, but for the first time in his life, Jake felt a little less burdened by the past. There were still hot stones next to the stove. Lily's scent lingered where the blanket had been folded. Jake sat down. He put his hands over his face. Tears flowed, but this time not from pain. It was cleansing. The next days were quiet. Neighbors came and went. Even reporters came, but Jake didn't tell anyone anything. Flat stories like, an animal came, left its baby, and the man rescued it, went around. But nobody knew. They didn't know what happened, what really happened. Even if they did, they couldn't understand. Jake started walking to the same place every morning. The entrance to the forest. A piece of Lily's blanket in his hand, Jax beside him. Every morning he sat there, staring out across the meadow. Even though she knew he wasn't coming, she waited. But one morning, Jax stopped suddenly. He pricked up his ears. He fixed his eyes. And Jake sat up immediately. Across the field, in the bushes, there was a movement. Jake stood up. His heart raced. He had been waiting for this moment for so long, but he didn't have the courage. He was afraid it was real. What if there was something out there? What if it was starting again? A head emerged from the gap. A lion cub, but no longer tiny. It was bigger, stronger, more upright. His eyes were still the same color, but his gaze had changed. It looked into Jake's eyes. Then it turned away. Another shadow approached from the jungle, the mother lion. They walked side by side. Silently. Slowly. Jake's eyes filled. But this time, he didn't fall to the ground. He didn't kneel. He stood up. He straightened his chest. He stepped without taking his eyes off them. As the distance between them closed, a peace spread through Jake. The lion stopped a few meters away. The cub stepped forward. Jake bent down. He held out his hand. The lion cub rubbed its nose against Jake's hand. In that moment, Jake realized something. This animal hadn't just survived. It remembered. The trust. The bond. The hand extended to him. The mother lion was silent, but it was as if her eyes were full. They say animals don't cry, but sometimes looks say more than the deepest tears. Jake didn't pull back. He bowed his head, his eyes full. "Welcome back," he said. "I've been waiting for you." The lions stayed a few more minutes. Then they went back into the forest. They didn't even look back. Because this time, there was no goodbye. There was only knowing, understanding, to feel, and connecting. Every day after that, Jake left a container of water and some food at the edge of his field. The forest remained silent, but the tracks remained. Footprints, broken branches, tiny claw scratches. All reminders that Jake was not alone. And one night, as they sat on the porch, Jax was suddenly startled. Jake looked up. They locked eyes, but this time, there was another meaning. Jake was sitting quietly on the porch. His eyes fell on the empty water jug he had left earlier. Only a few drops of rainwater had collected in it. No one had come to drink it. But in the morning, when he saw those tracks in the woods again, he shivered, as if there was still a connection. But then nothing happened. Not a sound. Not a look. Jax lay next to her. Even in sleep, he moved his ears, reacting to every crunch. Jake stroked the dog's head with one hand. "We make a good team," he said, but his voice was soft, broken. Then he realized, loneliness is not just not having someone around. Sometimes loneliness was a lion gone. Sometimes it's the silence left behind. The village was quiet. No one was around. The lights in the farmhouses were on sporadically. People had returned to their own lives. The lion incident was forgotten, or wanted to. But Jake, he couldn't forget. He kept going to the same place every morning. Every day he walked across the field. Every day he waited, sometimes for hours. But the forest was quiet, even if sometimes a leaf rustled, even if it sounded like a bird flying. Jake was always filled with the same question: will they return? One morning, before sunrise, when it was still dark, Jax made a strange noise outside the window. Jake opened his eyes, got up. He put his slippers on his feet. He looked out the window. There was a shadow cast on the front porch. Small, low, an animal. But what? Jake opened the door slowly. The shadow didn't run. He blinked. It was a fox. But it was carrying something in its mouth. Jake took a few steps. The fox put its head down. Then it looked at Jake. They locked eyes. The fox's eyes were black, but there was something in them. Then it turned and ran away. Jake bent down. He picked up what the fox had left. It was an object wrapped in straw, a piece of cheesecloth. And inside, Lily's old hairpin. How could this be? Jake's hands began to shake. He remembered that this hairpin had disappeared years ago. How could it be? Where had the fox gotten it? Why had he brought it to Jake? The unknowns racked his brain. But then he realized something. The direction the fox came from was through the forest. Maybe it was a sign. Maybe it was a call. Maybe something was still there. The next morning, Jake packed his morning bag. He took some water, some food, Lily's hair clip, and Jax. He started walking into the woods. There was a hesitation in his steps. His feet were used to it, but inside he was uneasy. It was as if his heart wanted to go and see, but never wanted to hear. It was cool in the forest. The birdsong was loud, but the wind was low. Jake walked. Jax was leading, but suddenly he stopped. His tail straightened. His ears pointed forward. Jake approached silently. They came to a clearing, and there were tracks lying open in the dirt. Claw marks. Big, deep, fresh. Jake knelt down and looked. He could hear his heart beating. These marks, they couldn't be from the day before. It was too new, too real. He stared forward. A movement. Jake stood up. He didn't take a step. He waited. The movement came closer. The leaves moved. And what appeared was not a lion. It was an old man. Gray hair, a fur vest on his back. Jake stepped back in surprise. Who are you? He asked. The man approached. His eyes were hazy but wise. You're Jake, he said. They trusted you. Jake didn't know what to say. The man pulled something out of his pocket. A small note. There were dirt stains on it, but the writing was legible. You protected it. This earth will speak to you now. Listen to the silence. Jake narrowed his eyes. The man said nothing more. He smiled. Then he disappeared into the forest. His departure was quiet. But the feeling he left behind created a storm inside Jake. That note, those words, he knew now that someone had thanked him. But was it an animal? A spirit? Or just Jake's own inner voice? Maybe all of them. And in that moment, Jake looked up to the sky. The wind blew on his forehead. The rustling of the trees whispered something to him. He couldn't quite hear what it was. But he understood he was no longer alone. Not ever. For the first time in days, Jake woke up with no expectations. He wasn't preparing to walk into the woods, nor was he expecting shade on the porch. That morning, he got up quietly. Jax didn't even follow him. Maybe he'd given up, too. Jake reached for the coffee maker but didn't press the button. He pulled his hand away. He didn't want to do anything today. For the last few weeks his life had been a silent knot. The lions were gone. The fox had come. The old man had appeared and then disappeared. Was it all real? Or were they images created by her pain? She didn't know the answer. Maybe it wasn't the answer that mattered anymore, but what he felt. But at that moment, there were 3 knocks on the door. Jake froze. He wasn't expecting anyone that morning. The neighbors wouldn't come at that hour. Even the delivery guy wouldn't show up until noon. He approached the door. He took a deep breath. He turned the knob and opened it slowly. There was no one in front of the door, but there was something on the floor. Lily's notebook. Jake immediately recognized the notebook with the small red cover and frayed edges that he thought had been lost in her hospital room all those years ago. He bent down with trembling hands and picked it up. It was still the same as it had been the moment he closed it. Inside were Lily's childish writings, little hearts she had drawn, and a dried daisy stuck between the pages. But at last, a new page had been opened, and there, in a different handwriting, was written just one sentence. "You did the right thing." Jake's knees gave out. He just collapsed there. Tears suddenly flowed, as if he had been waiting there for years. This was a confirmation. Maybe from God, maybe from nature, maybe from Lily, maybe just from himself. But it was there, and it was real. That evening at sunset, Jake walked into the center of the meadow. He had his notebook in his hand. He was wearing Lily's old jacket. It was faded, but for Jake it was the brightest thing that day. Just then there was a stir at the edge of the woods. Jake wasn't startled. He was no longer afraid. A silhouette emerged from the shadows. Big, graceful, silent. A mother lion. But she was not alone. The little one she had known as a cub was now a young male lion. The hair on his neck had grown long. His posture was erect. But his eyes, they were still familiar. The same eyes that still looked at him in Lily's room. The mother lion took a step. They stopped. They stared. Then the cub approached Jake. She rubbed her nose on his hand. Jake closed his eyes. In that moment, the past, present, and future came together. Everything went silent. Even time stopped. And Jake whispered quietly, "Welcome, my son." Maybe it was real. Maybe it was a metaphor. But in that moment, Jake seemed to hear Lily's voice. "You're not alone anymore, Dad." And in that moment, Jake understood. When he saved the cub, he had saved not just a life, but his own. The next day, news spread through the village. Years later, Jake had donated his farm to a foundation. It was to be preserved as a natural habitat. Humans would now house the animals. Instead of harming them, they would stand by them, just like a lion once stood by Jake. But the story didn't end there, because there's still a pot of water in that forest. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, there's a roar, quiet, but strong, like the echo of a vineyard. Now I ask you, what would you have done? Would you take that cub home? Would you find that mother lion worth waiting for on your porch? Would you go against your instincts? Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe, like the video, and don't forget to comment. If you want to hear more stories like this, be with me. Because nature sometimes brings us back not just an animal, but a piece of our heart, and some bonds transcend species. Forever. What if it was you? Would you protect that cub? Would you trust that mother lion? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. Thank you for listening. See you in the next story.